Hello and welcome to Crime Watch Daily Updates. I'm your host, Anna Garcia. Curtis Lovelace was a model citizen in Quincy, Illinois. He previously worked as an assistant state's attorney, doted over his 4 children, played Division I football in college, and even spent time serving on the local school board. But that would all come crashing down. While the rest of the world knows that February 14th is Valentine's Day, that fateful day in 2006 would be marked by tragedy for the Lovelace family. That morning, Curtis dropped off 3 of his children at school and returned home to shower while his wife, Cory, stayed in bed with flu-like symptoms. When he got home and walked into his bedroom, he found Cory dead. Cory was a beautiful blonde with a big smile, but she also reportedly suffered from alcoholism and an eating disorder. The autopsy found that Cory had a fatty and enlarged liver. The pathologist also noticed some marks in Cory's lip that matched some suffocation cases. Her death was initially listed as undetermined. Curtis remarried, got divorced, and then married again, and his life seemed to be moving on until everything changed. On August 27th of 2014, police arrested Curtis on suspicion of first-degree murder for the death of Cory. Detectives reopened the case, and prosecutors alleged that Cory had been suffocated to death at least 10 hours before Curtis called police. Curtis went on trial in 2016, but the jury could not agree on a verdict. So the judge declared a mistrial. He was tried again in 2017 and found not guilty. After his acquittal, Curtis sued Quincy Police and Adams County on behalf of himself and his children, saying that he was wrongly accused and his kids were unlawfully detained to get them to falsely implicate their father in their mother's death. In July of 2022, he won a $4.5 million civil suit. Since the trial, he's moved away from Quincy to start over. Let's look back at the case of a mother's unfortunate death and her husband who had to leave his own hometown to begin anew.
The world is turned upside down for a pillar of the community, former prosecutor Curtis Lovelace, on trial for the second time for the murder of his first wife.
Cory was dead. That's what I saw.
He used to make closing arguments before the jury. Now, in a desperate gamble, he takes the stand to convince them of his innocence or lose it all.
When he got called, the courtroom was kind of in shock. I don't think anyone was fully prepared for him to actually end up taking the stand.
Beside him, a loyal third wife.
I've never once not believed in my husband because I absolutely do know there was no crime.
In front of him, a second ex-wife with a serious grudge.
The children were called down to stop me from calling the police.
And in the grave, his first wife, whose death is a matter of debate between the experts.
It's clear that she's a victim of homicide and that she was suffocated.
Who killed Cory Lovelace?
There was nothing at the scene to suggest that she had been suffocated.
This prosecutor's jaw-dropping claim? No one did.
I think they started to create a crime so that they could arrest someone.
Did you kill Cory?
And Crime Watch Daily has his first daytime TV interview since the verdict came in.
And what was your truth?
But first, the story. It begins over a decade ago. It was Valentine's Day, but in the small town of Quincy, Illinois, there would be no romantic breakfast in bed for Curtis and Cory Lovelace. According to Kurt, Cory had been sick for several days with flu-like symptoms. And since it was normally her job to take the 3 oldest of their 4 children to school, Kurt's morning was spent chasing kids around their cramped 2-story house.
It was a Monday morning. Cory came downstairs.
They hugged their mother, they said bye to their mother. One of them, Logan Lovelace, said he even told his mom, "Can I stay home and take care of you?" And she said no.
After that, Curtis helped his wife upstairs, then rushed the kids off to school. Just the beginning of what would be a very long day. According to Curtis, around 45 minutes later, he raced through his front door and up the stairs for a quick shower before work. And that's when he saw her. Lying in bed, her arms slightly raised, hands bent toward her chest, eyes wide open.
Curtis noticed she wasn't moving. He immediately called his boss at work, who was the state's attorney.
Before long, first responders were at the house confirming the worst. Cory Lovelace was dead. She was only 38. It seemed so sudden, so out of the blue. But was it?
When I heard that Cory had died that morning, I was not overly surprised. I was very sad, but I was not surprised.
Cory was, by almost all accounts, a daily drinker, an illness she had carried for years, if not decades.
The last time I saw her was about 6 months before she died, and she did not look well at all. She was drinking heavily. Her face was very puffy. She was very thin. She was not well.
When officers investigate the scene, they even find a half-empty vodka tonic on her nightstand. And when hospital pathologist Jessica Bauman examines Cory later that day, she finds a body broken down and a possible cause of death.
She had a condition called steatosis of the liver. Her liver had enlarged twice the size of a normal liver, and it was caused because of alcoholism. And this is a condition that can cause sudden death.
But there was one little thing that Dr. Bowman couldn't ignore.
There was a mark on her lip right here on the front, and then there was also a mark on the inside of the lip.
The pathologist who did the autopsy requested that detectives investigate that.
She had seen similar marks before in suffocation cases.
It correlated with what someone would do if they pushed pressure down on someone's mouth and applied that pressure long enough to obviously suffocate her.
One expert would later speculate such a crime could be carried out with a pillow. But if that were the case, police should have found blood.
And there was none. There was no petechial hemorrhaging, which is common if you have a smothering or suffocation. And so police detectives conducted extensive interviews of Curtis, all 4 children. The oldest daughter described the mother as having fallen over the weekend, which could explain the cut lip. And there was, no foul play suspected at the end of the investigation. And it was a closed case.
Well, not exactly. Though the pathologist was fairly certain that Cory's fatty liver was what killed her, it couldn't be listed as an official cause of death.
There was no exact cause that could be pointed to. When you have a stroke, for instance, you have evidence of a blood clot that would cause someone to die. With steatosis of the liver, there's no smoking gun.
And because of that, Cory Lovelace's death was ruled undetermined. Case closed, but door left open. Curtis moves on with his life, a single father raising 4 kids. 2 years after Cory's death, he marries again to a woman named Erica Gomez. But after 6 years together, the couple splits. And later, court testimony paints it as a bitter divorce for Erica.
She was very bitter. She was not happy about that.
Soon after that, Curtis is reunited with an acquaintance from his past. She becomes his 3rd and present wife.
My husband and I went to school together. He was my high school homecoming date.
She even adopts his kids.
There's a portion of our wedding that we called the family ceremony, and each one of our children stepped into a circle and made a commitment to our family.
And finally, life approaches something like normal for Curtis and the family. But remember Cory's autopsy and that open door? It's about to get blown off the hinges. It happens on a day 8 years after Cory's death as Kurt heads out of his office to lunch. Instead, he's met by cops, placed under arrest.
When they arrested Kurt, they threw him up against his car, they put handcuffs on him and told him he was being arrested for the first-degree murder of his wife.
His first wife, that is, Cory Lovelace. And Christine is reeling, shocked by the news.
My response was one of, Cory wasn't murdered. That doesn't make any sense.
Next, why did police reopen the file on Cory's death?
I was like, my God, what did they have?
And the marathon court battles that lead Curtis Lovelace to take the stand in what could be his last stand. The small town of Quincy, Illinois is rocked by the arrest of one of its favorite sons, Curtis Lovelace. One-time football hero, Army National Guardsman, and Assistant State's Attorney. No one was more upstanding than Kurt, until he was charged with the first-degree murder of his first wife, Cory Lovelace.
It was brutally, emotionally devastating.
In fact, when Cory was found dead years before, it wasn't even ruled a crime.
My husband and I were absolutely shocked. It never occurred to us that Cory died from anything but alcoholism, the side effects of alcoholism.
A conclusion supported by the original investigators. So then what changed?
This has been 8 years and he's got charged with murder. He's on a $5 million bond. I was like, my God, what? I mean, this would have to be, ironclad, something solid, What did they have?
Enter Detective Adam Gibson.
Adam Gibson opened the case from the fact that as a newly detective, they looked through old case files, saw this, thought there were some weird things or inconsistencies, so things didn't seem right to him.
In particular, Detective Gibson thought the position of Cory's arms seemed suspicious, like they'd been holding something, like a pillow. And then there was that mark on Cory's lip, the kind sometimes seen in suffocation cases. But after speaking to both the coroner who saw Cory at the scene and pathologist Dr. Jessica Bowman, who performed her autopsy, Gibson hits a brick wall.
He was told there were problems with your theory. There was no evidence of blood on the pillow. If this was a suffocation, you would expect bleeding and blood. There was none. Instead of closing the file, he goes on and he gets referred to another forensic pathologist, Dr. Shakutis in Chicago.
Gibson sends Chicago pathologist Dr. Shakutis a 4-page summary of the case. Her conclusion, quote, "It was clearly not a homicide."
Not only that, she goes further and says there was no evidence of suffocation at all, and gave all these reasons why this could be a natural death. And he didn't like the answers he was getting.
Dr. Tees also sends Gibson an email stating, "I find no evidence to suggest that Cory Lovelace was suffocated or asphyxiated."
You got 3 pathologists, medical doctors, telling him that there are problems with the theory that this was a homicide by suffocation.
But Detective Gibson reaches out to a 4th, Dr. Jane Turner of St. Louis, and a 5th, famed pathologist Dr. Michael Bodden. And what they had to say was enough for a grand jury to indict Curtis Lovelace for the crime of murder.
A very close friend of mine one day at lunch asked me, is there going to be a big aha moment, like a Matlock kind of a moment? And I said, I don't know what it would be. You'll have to stay tuned like the rest of us.
The court battle begins, and one of the first questions that needs to be answered is why Curtis would want his wife dead in the first place.
Cory never had an insurance policy. Kurt didn't have an insurance policy. They were living just above poverty, so there was no motive for Kurt to kill Cory.
The prosecution wanted the people to understand this was not a happy household, and that Curtis basically said enough is enough, and then led to wanting to kill his wife.
But that's hardly enough to indict someone for murder. So just what did the prosecution's expert pathologists have?
The photos in the prosecution's case showed signs that she could not have died that morning. Her arms were in rigor mortis, hovering over her body in unnatural positions.
And based on that positioning, both Drs. Turner and Bodden concluded that not only had Cory been suffocated with something like a pillow, but her body had been in rigor mortis for at least 10 hours. Of course, there was one big hole in that theory. Make that 4 big holes.
All 4 kids reported that their mom was alive that morning, on Valentine's morning. That mom came downstairs, got a pair of jeans out of the laundry, that she made sure that they took their Valentine cards to school. Their memories were very clear that their mother was alive that morning.
And as for the rigor mortis, pathologist George Nichols, witness for the defense, testified that rigor mortis varies between people and can set in as little as 30 minutes.
The defense was also kind of pointing out the fact that in the original overview with Detective Jeff Baird and coroner Gary Hamilton, that the rigor mortis was very mild at the time of the scene.
Finally, Nichols concludes, if this woman was suffocated by a pillow, I've missed dozens of homicides in my career.
The only existing disease process in her body was that of an abnormal liver.
So if there was no crime, why was Kurt on trial? On the stand, Detective Gibson testified that the grand jury which indicted Kurt only ever heard from one witness, Detective Gibson.
And he even admitted under oath he didn't bring up Dr. Shakutiz's email to the grand jury. He only brought up the report from Dr. Turner.
There were multiple doctors contacted before one of them would say that they thought that this could be a homicide. I think it was evident right away to most of the people in the gallery there was no case here.
But maybe not so evident to the jury. After 2 days of deliberation, they can't seem to make up their minds. Was Cory killed by her husband or by her own liver failure?
Later than that evening, I got the text message to return to the courthouse.
And the news is not good for Curtis. The jury is split 6-6. The judge declares a mistrial.
I started crying. I was shaking. I was so distraught. And my husband told me, babe, I'm not coming home.
Cameras follow the family out of the courtroom.
You guys have any reactions, guys?
Curtis returns to his jail cell. It's a major setback, but he and his family are not giving up.
We have the truth on our side, and that's the most important thing. When you have the truth, you will win.
Next, after spending most of the next year behind bars, Curtis Lovelace gets his last shot at proving his innocence. A new trial, and this time, he's taking the stand. But he has a new problem. Wife number 2, testifying against him.
Are you claiming you know that Kurt killed his wife now?
I know.
Okay, how do you know?
I watched him get rid of evidence.